Hi, welcome to lesson two of our study here. And let me start with a review of the first lesson because everything depends on it. The way anti Semitism is usually discussed starts too late in the story. Anti Semitism does not begin with hatred or violence, those things come later. Anti-Semitism begins much more quietly. It begins with an explanatory need. It starts when a society feels anxious, confused, or morally disoriented, and it needs a story to explain why things aren't working the way that they were supposed to do. When institutions fail, when ideals collapse, when outcomes don't match intentions, people reach for a narrative that restores coherence. And that's where the Jews enter into the picture. Not as enemies first, but as explanations. You can see this happening right now. Take parts of the progressive left. When moral projects fail to deliver the promised outcomes, when justice doesn't arrive, when movements fracture, when power doesn't behave according to their theory, the explanation quietly becomes Zionists or donors or lobbies. The Jews may not be hated yet at that time, but they're useful. They explain why the story broke without requiring anyone to refake the story itself. Now, we see this on college campuses after October 7th. I'm sure you saw it on the news and what was going on. In a lot of places, Jewish students were immediately treated as villains. They were treated as representatives, people who had to account for global violence, for imperialism, or Western guilt, simply by existing as Jews. They become walking explanations for events they did not cause. Here's what it looks like at the ground level. A Jewish student sits in a seminar, says nothing about Israel, and still gets the same look when conversations turn to power. Someone asks casually what they think about what's happening, not because they know anything specific about this person, but because the room has already assigned them a role. They aren't a student in that moment, they're a proxy. Now, you see this on the nationalist right as well. So the Trump-style nationalism promised unity and meaning, but it delivered anger without a vision. And that failure became harder to ignore. America first hardened into America only, a rejection of pluralism and independence in favor of an impossible fantasy of self-sufficiency. At that point, anti-Semitism doesn't appear by accident. It reemerges as a way to explain failure without admitting the ideology itself is broken. Jews become targets because they're just frozen to the limits of a closed nationalism. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and the list goes on. You see the same pattern online, especially in conspiracy culture, where Jews are presented as the invisible connective tissue. The group supposedly links finance and media and war and culture and politics into a single hidden system. And again, the move isn't hatred at first, it's explanatory. And this is the danger. Once a group becomes the explanation, it eventually becomes the problem. Once people stop questioning the story, resentment hardens. Moral pressure turns into suspicion. Suspicion turns into hostility. And by the time hatred appears, the groundwork has already been laid. Anti-Semitism doesn't begin with violence, it begins with explanation. It begins at the moment when a society looks at the world it has produced and doesn't like what it sees, but it cannot accept it. Then it produced it. Now here's the critical moment. At this point, the society has a choice. It can ask whether it deals or it can ask whether its ideals are incomplete, whether it's the systems that involve trade-offs it didn't want to acknowledge, whether some forms of harm are structural rather than malicious, or it can look for an explanation that leaves its moral self-image untouched. And this is where anti-Semitism enters the picture, not as hatred, but again as explanation. Not we built something with limits, but something interfered. Not our framework has the cost, but someone distorted it. The system was good, the values were pure, but the outcome must therefore be the result of manipulation. And it's in that explanatory gap sets a figure who is not quite a person. The Jews never existed. It's not a claim about the Jews are imaginary. It is the name of an abstraction that replaces real Jews. It's a symbolic figure created to do moral work that real people cannot do. This Jew has no biography, no internal disagreements, no class position, no political diversity, no ordinary failures. He is not your neighbor, your worker, or your doctor, or your friend. He becomes an explanatory device. He can be blamed for outcomes that contradict the society's self-understanding. And here's the key thing to notice. He is blamed not because he is expressly visible, but because he's available. Available to carry contradiction, available to absorb guilt, available to explain failure without requiring self-revision. This is why anti-Semitism so often appears in calm, analytical language. Not screaming, but asking questions. Not hatred, but critiquing power. Not violence, but patterns of influence, representation. It sounds reasonable. It sounds responsible. It even sounds morally serious. And that is precisely the danger. Because what is really being protected in that moment is not truth, but innocence. The feeling that we are still the good ones. And that whatever went wrong must have been caused by someone else. And so this is the work of anti-Semitism does at the beginning. Not in the end, but in the beginning. It begins sometimes not with cruelty, not with hatred, but moral preservation. Once that explanatory need exists, a transformation begins. And it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it does not announce itself. The first thing that happens is that Jews become an abstraction. This is the moment when Jews are no longer engaged as neighbors, as co-workers, or as citizens. Not explicitly rejected yet, simply abstracted. They are no longer encountered, but they are interpreted. Lifted out of the social world and repositioned as a symbolic figure. You see, what happens is the Jews become something else. They're not a person you argue with or disagree with or forgive, but a figure capable of carrying out contradiction, without breaking. And so this is how the mechanism seems to work. Real people can't do this. Real people are too specific, too inconsistent, too humane. They won't fit the preconceived mold. They have biographies that complicate the story. They disagree with one another. They fail in visible, mundane ways. They can't cooperate with a clean narrative. But an abstraction can. Once the Jew exists as a symbolic figure, he can absorb mutually exclusive accusations without collapsing under them. He can be blamed for dissolving tradition and enforcing rigid law, for being rootless and cosmopolitan and suffocating tribal, for undermining national identity, refusing to assimilate. And this does not register as confusing to those using the narrative. It feels like insight. Because the purpose of the abstraction is not accuracy. It simply serves as explanatory power. The figure exists to explain why systems that promise justice, equality, and progress ended up producing harm instead. Not because ideals involve trade-offs, not because power is impersonal, distributed, or constrained, not because good intentions can still generate unintended consequences. No. The harm happened because something interfered. The abstraction becomes the explanation, and that keeps the moral story intact. Let me put this in another way. When a society turns Jews into abstraction, it is not discarding them, it is using them. Think of a load-bearing wall in a building. The wall isn't decorative. It carries weight the rest of the structure can't carry on its own. If you remove it without redesigning the building, everything collapses. The abstract Jew functions like that wall. Every system that promises justice or equality or coherence eventually produces outcomes that contradict those promises. And this contradiction creates pressure, and that pressure has to go somewhere. A healthy society distributes it across trade-offs, unintended consequences, institutional limits, and shared responsibility. But a society committed to persevering its innocence concentrates the weight instead. It builds a single figure strong enough to hold it. That figure is not lame because he is weak. He is lame because he is structurally useful. Remove the abstraction and the story collapses. Question it, and the system has to explain itself. So the abstraction is protected, even while being accused. That's why Jews can carry mutually exclusive charges without the narrative breaking. They can be capitalists, and they can be communists. They can be insiders and outsiders, omnipotent and powerless. The contradictions don't matter, because he isn't there to be understood. He's there to do structural work. And this is the clarification that matters most, because this is where people often misunderstand what's happening. The Jew is not blamed because he's especially visible. He's blamed because he is available. He's available to hold contradiction, available to absorb blame, available to spare everyone else the work of change. And this is why anti-Semitism It's not just the prejudice that goes astray. It's a narrative that functions efficiently. It does explanatory work that other stories cannot. It explains failure without indicting ideals. It assigns agency without requiring responsibility. It produces clarity without truth. And because it works, because it stabilizes meaning at the exact moment meaning is under threat, it doesn't feel like hatred to the people using it. It feels like understanding. And that's the danger. That's why anti-Semitism survives even in societies convinced of their own decay. And this is where the argument has to move against expectation. Because what I'm describing isn't most visible at the extremes. It's actually most visible at the moral center. Not primarily among people who see themselves as cruel or reactionary or hateful, but among people invested in seeing themselves as humane, enlightened, and historically justified. That matters because it tells us where anti-Semitism actually lives, where people are confident they're on the right side of history, where moral identity feels secure, where cruelty is something other people do. These are people who believe in justice, who speak the language of equality and inclusion fluently, who generally want the world to be better than it is. And then something goes wrong. Justice-oriented systems explicitly are designed to reduce suffering, produce suffering instead. That moment is destabilizing, not just politically, but morally, because it threatens more than outcomes, it threatens identity. If we are just, how did this happen? If our values are sound, why does harm persist? And it is at that point the promise has to be defended. And this is the key move. The abstraction of the Jews allows that defense without requiring open hatred. This is why this mechanism is so resilient. And this is why it keeps returning long after people are certain they've outgrown it. Now here's an illustration that makes the structure visible. Now at this point I want to make something absolutely explicit, because it's easy to underestimate how deliberate this structure is. The abstraction I'm describing is not an accident. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not the result of intellectual laziness. Actually, it is required. For the story to work, for moral innocence to survive, certain things have to be stripped away. History has to go. Internal disagreement has to go. Class position disappears. Political diversity disappears. Moral failure disappears. Everything that would complicate the figure, everything that would introduce friction or demand judgment is removed. So what replaces it is not ignorance, but coherence. A single agent, clean, continuous, explanatory, capable of accounting for incompatible outcomes without facing the system itself into question. These are why the accusations are not inconsistent. They are multifunctional. The same thinker can be blamed for dissolving tradition and enforcing religious law, for undermining boundaries and policing them too aggressively, for being rootless and cosmopolitan and suffocatingly tribal. I want to underline this because this is where people often misread what has happened. This is not confusion. This is not contradiction. This is the design. Let me give you a way to see that design is necessary. Think about how we normally deal with complexity. Complexity demands judgment. It forces us to weigh trade-offs, to accept partial responsibility, to tolerate outcomes that cannot be morally purified. But a moral story that depends on innocence cannot tolerate that. So instead of complexity, it requires compression. Now I want to turn the lens carefully but directly towards the habits that many of us bring into moral life itself. Because the mechanism I'm describing does not require bad intentions. It requires something more common. It requires a desire for moral clarity, an impatience with ambiguity, a preference for villains over limits, and there is a reversal that matters. These traits are often praised. They are taught. They are rewarded. They are treated as ethical virtues. We admire people who know where they stand. We distrust hesitation. We confuse certainty with courage. So the problem here is not moral seriousness itself. Moral seriousness matters. The problem is seriousness that cannot admit limits. In practice, these habits make abstraction possible. When moral life is framed primarily as a malign and condemnation, when the central question becomes who is on the right side and who isn't to blame, anything that resists clean placement starts to feel dangerous. Ambiguity becomes suspect. Complexity feels evasive. Limits start to look like excuses. And it is at that point where moral seriousness quietly changes shapes. It stops about being about understanding and how harm actually happens, and becomes about persevering the clarity of one's position. Let me take you through a hypothetical slowly, because this is where the mechanism becomes visible. Picture a society that prides itself on being humane and egalitarian. Now its laws, but in its self-description. It tells a story about itself. We are the decent ones. We are inclusive. We are enlightened. We have learned the lessons of history. In public language, emphasizes dignity, equality, and fairness. Its institutions speak in the register of justice. Its schools teach it, its media repeats it, its politics is saturated with the performance of moral commitment. And most of the people in this society, most ordinary citizens, really do see themselves as morally decent. They try to be fair. They don't want cruelty. They believe inclusion is a baseline for good. So far, so reassuring. But then, over time, a contradiction emerges. None of this happens clearly or all at once, but the pressure builds anyway. Inequality grows, not in dramatic, cinematic ways, often in banal, administrative ones. Housing becomes impossible. wages stagnate, wealth consolidates, opportunities narrow, people begin to feel that the future has been quietly foreclosed. And what happens? Trust erodes. People stop believing institutions are neutral. They stop believing the rules apply evenly. And they begin to assume outcomes are rigged, if not formally, then practically. The civic atmosphere changes. The temperature drops. Public life becomes harsher and more alienating. People speak to each other with less patience. There's more suspicion. There's more exhaustion. This sense of shared membership thins out. The public square starts to feel like a competition for scarce oxygen rather than a common project. And this is the emotional hinge. The moment that matters most. These outcomes are disturbing not only because they hurt people, but because they contradict the society's self-image. This is not just about policy failure. It's about moral identity crisis. Because if we are humane, how did we produce this? If we are egalitarian, why does life feel increasingly unequal? If we are inclusive, why does public life feel so cold? And it's at this moment that society is staring into a mirror, and what it sees does not match the story it tells about itself. The problem here is not fragility, it is the cost of admitting that the image itself may be incomplete. The fear is not simply that society has failed, but that it might not be who it thinks it is. Now, here is the critical point. A society can respond to that moment in two ways. It can treat the mirror as information, something that demands self-revision and humility, and uncomfortable reassessment. Or it can treat the mirror as a threat, a mirror that must not crack, a reflection that must not be trusted. When moral identity is central, when decency itself is the society's core self-understanding, the second response becomes very tempting. Because rewriting the story can feel like betrayal. Betrayal of progress. Betrayal of history. Betrayal of one's own goodness. So the contradiction has to be explained without revising the story. Once innocence becomes non-negotiable, explanation becomes mandatory. And it's at this point leaders, institutions, and ordinary systems all participate, often unconsciously, in choosing explanation over revision. Not in a coordinated way, more like a set of incentives that quietly align. Some people gain power by amplifying the story. Some gain moral clarity by repeating it. And most people gain relief by accepting it. That is the moment that explanatory hunger begins. That is when culture starts looking urgently for an explanation that preserves innocence. An explanation that allows society to say, we are still who we think we are. Something else must account for this. And it is at precisely this moment when outcomes cannot be tolerated and self-revision feels impossible. That extraction becomes necessary. Now we arrive at what defines the next phase. Rather than questioning whether its ideals are incomplete or whether some trade-offs are unavoidable, the society looks for an explanation that preserves innocence. This is not usually articulated out loud. No one stands up and says our values cannot be questioned, but the assumption operates quietly, powerfully in the background. The ideas are treated as sacrosanct. Justice itself cannot be the problem. Equality can be the problem, cannot be the problem. Inclusion cannot be the problem. To question the framework would feel like betrayal of history, of progress, of one's own moral identity. And so, if the outcomes are disturbing, then the servants must come from somewhere else. Not from the structure, not from the incentives, not from the limits of human institutions, elsewhere. And something distorted the process. Something interfered. Something exploited the system from within. And at this point, refusal hardens in the narrative. And it's important to be precise about what's happening here. The society is not simply avoiding explanation, but it has selected one. This outcome is not inevitable, but because increasingly likely, a self-critique is foreclosed, and innocence is treated as non-negotiable. Diffuse impersonal forces will not do. Trade-offs are unsatisfying. Structural explanations feel evasive. Limits start to sound like moral failure. What the society needs is not complexity but clarity. And clarity requires an agent. The framework remains pure, the self-image remains intact, and the contradiction has somewhere to go. At this point, it's crucial to notice how the story is told, because the language is rarely crude. It is rarely overtly hateful. In fact, it often sounds careful, almost responsible. You hear phrases like disproportionately influential, overrepresented, highly networked, excessively skilled at navigating institutions. These are not slurs. They sound empirical. They sound like the vocabulary of analysis rather than animus. Often they're presented as reluctant observations, not noticing patterns, just asking questions, just criticizing power. And to be clear, sometimes groups really are overrepresented in certain fields. And what matters is whether you treat that fact as a proper explanation or as a proof of intent. And that is precisely where they work. The tone is analytical, but the function is unchanged. Systematic failures reinterpreted as manipulation. Harm becomes interference. Structure disappears. The question is no longer, where did we build? It becomes, who gamed it? So let me be clear about the scope of the claim here. The problem is not analysis itself. Analysis matters. The problem is analysis that stops at pattern recognition and treats patterns as moral explanation. Let me make this mechanism visible. Think about how the spreadsheet works. A spreadsheet is powerfully, precisely, because it reduces complexity. It strips away content, biography, intention, disagreement, and history in order to surface patterns. Used carefully, that can be helpful, but a spreadsheet cannot tell you why a pattern exists. If you treat the pattern itself as explanation, you begin to mistake correlation for agency. And I think this is what's happening here. Overrepresentation becomes intention, Visibility becomes coordination. Presence becomes interference. Most of us don't encounter this logic in Excel spreadsheets, but in headlines, charts shared online, dashboards, confident summaries that assure us the numbers speak for themselves. And once Jews are treated as an analytical category rather than as a people, explanation no longer requires understanding. The figures appear to explain themselves. And once that shift happens, complexity is no longer required. Trade-offs vanish. Institutional incentives fade from view. And this means historical contingency disappears. Responsibility concentrates itself into a symbolic figure who can be blamed without resistance. The logic is sustained collectively, but those who produce the analysis, those who circulate it, those who repeat it without questioning what it replaces, and because the language feels restrained, measured, technical, and sober, people don't experience themselves as participating in something ugly. They experience themselves as being clear-eyed, serious, and even brave. And this is how the abstraction survives in respectable form. Let me be explicit about the boundary here. To analyze systems is necessary. To study power is legitimate. To criticize institutions is often essential. But the moment of analysis substitutes people from explanations when it converts visibility into guilt and patterns into agency. It crosses an ethical line. It is at that point analysis stops illuminating reality. It starts protecting the story from it. And that is the danger this section is meant to name. Describing patterns is not the same thing as explaining them. Noticing disparities is not the same thing as identifying causes. This is not an argument against studying groups. It's an argument against letting categories do the moral work that explanation should do. When analysis substitutes pattern, recognition for explanation, it stops being inquiry and becomes narrative maintenance. Analytical language does not become innocent simply because it avoids slurs. It sounds analytical, explains its appeal. It does not justify its use. This is how anti-Semitism adapts to moral environments that reject hatred but reward critique. It trades the language of animus with the language of analysis, while preserving the same function. And this is why this form is so difficult to recognize, especially among people who sincerely believe they are resisting prejudice rather than reproducing it. So now we can turn to the opening claim and see it more clearly. Nothing about this process requires people to see themselves as cruel. That's the deceptive part. Ordinary people remain well-intentioned. They continue to believe in the purity of their values. They can still say clearly and sincerely, I believe in justice, I believe in equality, I believe in inclusion, and they are not lying. But something disappears in the process. Trade-offs vanish. Unintended consequences vanish. Collective responsibility vanishes. Those ideas are unsettling. They suggest that harm can arise without malice, that good intentions can produce bad outcomes, and that responsibility can be shared even when no one intended the result. These are precisely the ideas of moral self-protection cannot tolerate. They are replaced, In their place appears a symbolic actor, someone who distorted what would otherwise have worked, someone who interfered, someone who gamed the system. Once that figure exists, the moral problem is solved. The values remain pure. The system remains it remains just in principle, and the self remains innocent. Let me offer one final way to see what is happening here. Think of this as an abstraction, as a kind of moral insurance policy. Insurance doesn't prevent damage, it protects you from having to absorb the full cost of it. When something goes wrong, the policy ensures that loss is displaced rather than earned. But insurance only works if you keep paying the premiums. The abstraction works the same way. It allows society to say, the harm is real, but it isn't ours. The suffering exists, but it does not implicate our values. The failure happened not because of what we built, the cost is covered elsewhere. And this is why the form of anti-Semitism feels stabilizing rather than transgressive. It doesn't ask people to abandon the moral commitments. It allows them to keep these commitments intact while relocating failure outside of the moral self. Most of us have relied on this assurance at some point, often without realizing what it cost. And this is the line that matters most. Anti-Semitism preserves moral decency, not by denying harm, but by denying responsibility. Responsibility does not disappear, it waits, unresolved, until someone is willing to take it back. Moral decency is preserved, not by confronting failure, but by refusing self-revision. That's why the form of anti-Semitism is so resilient. It does not announce itself as hatred, it presents itself as maintenance. And this is why it's hardest to see precisely where people are most convinced of their own goodness. So let me end where we began, with the figure in the title, the Jew who never existed. It's not a person you can meet. He has no life, no voice, no history of his own. He never argues fact. He never contradicts himself. He never surprises anyone. He exists only as long as he is needed. And this is the point. But anti-Semitism ultimately creates is not an enemy, but a substitute. A substitute for explanation. A substitute for responsibility. A substitute for difficult work of living with the consequences of our own ideals. The danger is not that society suddenly forget how to be moral. It is that they become so invested in their moral self-image that they can no longer tolerate what their own systems produce. When innocence becomes sacred, explanation becomes mandatory. And when explanation must persevere innocence, someone else must carry the weight. This is why this story repeats itself across ideologies and generations and moral languages. The details change, the accents shift, the slogans update, but the structure remains intact, because the need remains intact. Real Jews are inconvenient for this story. They are too plural, too ordinary, too contradictory, and too human. They break the spell simply by existing. So they are replaced by something cleaner, flatter, more useful, an abstraction. And once that abstraction is in place, people do not feel cruel. They feel serious. They feel responsible. They feel as though they are finally making sense of a confusing world. And this is why anti-Semitism is so persistent and why it is so easy to dismiss. It does not announce itself as hatred. It presents itself as an explanation. It doesn't feel like moral failure. It feels like moral clarity. So the real test is not whether we oppose anti-Semitism in its loudest and ugly forms. A lot of people do that. The harder test is whether we're willing to sit with complexity without reaching for the substitute. This is where the rubber meets the road. Whether we can tolerate outcomes that implicate us, systems that have limits, and ideals that carry costs. Because the moment we refuse that work, the story is already waning. And the Jew who never existed is always ready to take our place.